You're tuned into Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This is episode 77 on the errors and dangers of radical traditionalism with Don Dalmasso of the Logos Project. Before I get into introducing tonight's very special guest and the topic at hand, I just want to give a shout out to my sponsor, Havana Palace on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario, for the best service and finest cigars. Go see Caesar and Eli. They treat all their customers like family. And I just ask that you guys would be so kind as to go to facebook.com/Havana Palace and give their page a like. I would greatly appreciate it. They have their brand new house blends with custom rings that just came out. So I'm very proud of them, and they're excellent sticks. So if you're ever in the area, look them up. All right. So I have with me Dom Dalmasso of the Logos Project. Dom, how are you doing this evening, my brother?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Dustin. Love your show, and I'm really honored to be on.
Well, thank you so much. And I love the work that you're doing as well. Relatively recently introduced to it, but I was on Dom's show just a few days ago giving my conversion testimony. So I'm very excited to have Dom on and sort of return the favor. What caught my attention, Dom, is that you used to be a so-called traditionalist Catholic, and you've come out of that movement. So before we sort of get into the particulars of the errors and dangers of so-called radical traditionalism, why don't you tell the viewers, my viewers who might not be familiar with you, what's your spiritual background?
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. So it's an interesting story, I guess. As you said, so-called radical traditionalist movements. Words can be used, misused, abused. So I'll try to do my best to kind of explain what I mean and what I don't mean. But so my
Mm,
background was, I was born and raised. I was born and raised in the Society of Saint Pius X. Um, so we slowly transitioned away from the Society of Saint Pius X. It wasn't an overnight thing. It was more logistical and decisions my parents were making, and eventually, so between when I was 12 years old, I went to a school that wasn't of the society, but we
mm,
were still going to the society on Sundays. Eventually, around the age of 13, 14, we finally fully transitioned to the fraternity of St. Peter. And I went to high school in one of the fraternity's schools, learned a tremendous amount of things there. But really, so when I was a young teenager, I was in this boarding school where we would go hiking a lot in throughout France. So we would go hiking a lot in the French Alps, in
nice.
Brittany. Yeah, it's beautiful over there. Brittany is the western part of France that sticks out in direction towards the UK. That's pretty much where I grew up. We also camped in Alsace and southern France. We camped in
Wow.
the center of France. The what's it called? I can't remember the name of the department, but anyway, it's a lot of just beautiful, and the history there is so rich.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so what happened for me was just encountering the beauty in nature. uh, it had an effect on me that I don't think I fully realized, but it was somewhat of a religious experience, but it wasn't like a Pauline knockoff of my Damascus horse experience. It was more of a
Mm,
subtle, continuous nudging at me about questions like, is there a God? Why are we here? What are we here for? And so the transcendent started to kind of beckon me, I guess. And so that was just the beginning of a journey, internal journey that flourished and sometimes was slightly suffocated. But ultimately, it led to my joining the monastery. I joined a Benedictine monastery
oh,
of the
wow.
yes, so the Congregation of Salem. I was a novice there for approximately 2 years, a little less than 2 years, and at this point, I discovered in a new way, in a fresh way, the beauty of the sacred scriptures,
Mm,
in a way that, and I'm not blaming other people necessarily. A lot of this is my fault, but I discovered them in a way that I had never seen them before, and it was really an encounter of their personality, the personality of the Jewish people, especially in the Psalms.
mm,
And there was something in the personality of the Jewish people that pointed beyond itself, And so this is, I guess, it's in the monastery that I encountered Jesus Christ for the first time on a personal level through the
Right.
scriptures. And so it became very real for me what Saint Jerome says when he said ignorance of scripture is ignorance of Christ. I
Hmm.
realized I did not know Jesus Christ despite being surrounded with and swimming in Catholic culture. And so what that did is it changed me. But I left the monastery. It wasn't for me. It wasn't something that the Lord was calling me to do for the rest of my life. And so it was sad because the liturgy was beautiful. I learned so much, but I eventually left, and I didn't really know what I was going to do next. So I had a little bit of aimless wandering until I just decided to join the military, because my
Okay.
older brother had been in the Marine Corps, and as he was going out, I came in, and so I did a 4-year contract, and I practiced my faith. I received the sacraments, but it kind of took priority-wise a back seat because of my job, being surrounded
Hmm.
by non-Catholic secular friends, and it became unfortunately a bit irrelevant to me, despite the fact that I was still practicing.
Hmm.
And so it was a kind of a situation of apathy. But what changed was making Protestant friends. You
Okay.
know what they believed, and
Hmm.
the fact that they did follow Jesus Christ, and they saw the Catholic Church as something bad. Not all of them, but several of the ones that I became friends with, and so
Mm.
that veered me back into theology and apologetics, and finding good online resources. And
Right.
I discovered that I had never lost my thirst for the beauty of theology, and so I decided to become a full-time student and to study theology and philosophy. And I'm coming close to the end of my undergraduate degree, and but this is the time at which the whole traditionalist issue veered its head again, because many of my friends, including myself, were feeling a lot of discomfort in light of aspects of the papacy of our Holy Father, which
Hmm.
just it didn't jive with the things that I believed or that I held, or the tendencies, the emphases, that attitudes. And so I decided to take a deep dive and to try to make sense of everything going on. And I came out the other side with certain conclusions, and now I'm trying to share that with others to help them.
Wow, what a story. And
Thank you.
I just want to give a shout out to Father John Brown, SJ, who faithfully watches this channel as well as Reason and Theology. And my friend Tom as well is tuning in this evening. So good evening, gentlemen, and good evening, Father. Guys, please like and subscribe and share if you haven't already. And if anyone has any questions in the chat, just put them to @HolySmoke so I can distinguish them from other side conversations if there happen to be any. All right. So let me ask you a question. So you go to this monastery. Obviously, it's nothing to do with the SSPX.
No, this
So
monastery is fully in communion with Rome. Yes.
so even at that early stage, are your SSPX leanings and convictions being challenged while at this monastery? Like the SSPX has some views about the quote unquote Roman Catholic Church, but did you see those challenged or any myths kind of shattered when you were at that monastery?
Yes. It began slightly earlier because, as some people know, there is a kind of a turf war going on between the Society of St. Pius X and the Fraternity of St. Peter. There's an aspect in which the fraternity is kind of perceived as traitors,
Hmm.
compromisers, or bootlickers, and so
Yeah.
that animosity it informed me when I was in high school. So I did move away from the society and its stance, and there was a kind of rivalry there that was good. Communion is important, but despite that, there still was a very real sympathy towards the society, and I held that because of necessity, because of certain circumstances in the church today,
Mm,
that they were indeed our allies, despite this kind of trivial turf war thing going on. And
okay.
so it was at the monastery where that fully broke down. Not fully, it broke down a lot for me, because I encountered a community that loved the sacred liturgy,
Mhm.
celebrated it in a way that I haven't seen before when it comes to reverence, beauty. I learned so much about Gregorian chant. I now teach it at my parish as best I can. I'm still a puny amateur, but I love sharing the little I know.
That's
And
wonderful.
but I did not find this attitude of recognize and resist. We are
Yes.
the remnant church. We are the bulwark in the face of total apostasy. Again, these are generalizations, but they're real. They come hand in
Sure.
hand, unfortunately, with the traditionalist movement on the ground, but not in this community. And that's really where things began to change for me. And I started to look at the Second Vatican Council with less suspicion, as well as the magisterium of the post-conciliar modern popes. But I wasn't fully over my traditionalist itis, you might say. And
Right.
it really took Pope Francis's papacy to really make me decide to dive deep. And the conclusion I reached is that the SSPX, I can no longer be sympathetic to its position. And in fact, there are certain traditionalist cultures, you might say, or attitudes, even within the juridical structure of the church, that are indeed problematic. And they revolve around a suspicion, if not rejection, of aspects, if not the entirety, of the Second Vatican Council, including the magisterium of the popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis. And so I realized that there was an issue here when it comes, and John will say this over and over, as well as Andrew. All three of us kind of came to this conclusion, is that there's a fundamentally it's a fundamental ecclesiological problem. In the
Mhm.
name of being the remnant church and safeguarding tradition, the traditionalist movement, again, there's exceptions, as a spectrum, but as a whole, has come up with a modernist ecclesiology. And so this irony is really what made me second guess everything and dig deeper. So I went back and I started reading
Mhm.
St. Irenaeus, and I started reading St. Francis de Sales, St. Robert Bellarmine, the Council of Trent, Vatican I, and then I started reading modern theologians, Joseph Ratzinger,
Mhm.
Henri de Lubac, and as well as Thomas like Father Garrigou Lagrange, and just kind of doing a survey of the landscape. And I came to the conclusion that this idea that there can be a divorce between the teaching office of the magisterium, of the modern magisterium, and the preservation of capital T tradition is a modernist idea, and I cannot accept it any longer. And so, and anyway, and then the details about the Novus Ordo Missae, aspects about the council, why did we have it, all of that followed suit in my research, and this is why now I talk about it. So
Interesting.
yeah.
Well, you've had quite a journey, and now you've had the experience and have the resources to reach out and help others who may be struggling. Because let's be honest, there is a crisis in the church. Um,
Hmm.
well, one thing my friend Mike Aquilina told me is he said, if you want to keep your peace, this is one of the things that you have to remember. You have to get rid of the myth of the golden age of the church.
Yes.
There never was a golden age because there was always heresy, there was always infighting, there's always schism and scandal and bad clergy
Hmm.
and lax laity. You name it. It's always been there since day one. I mean, if you look at the New Testament in Colossae, they were committing incest. So, I
Hmm.
mean, this is nothing new, and God's not surprised by anything. But it's
No.
how do we respond? How do we plant ourselves? Where do we plant ourselves? And how do we respond to this crisis, both personally and as a community, as a communion?
Yes.
So when we're talking about radical traditionalism, Dom,
Hmm.
um, I understand that it's not a monolith, and like you
Hmm.
said, it is a spectrum. So we're not just talking about maybe talk about the different what you would call branches or types of radical traditionalism. How would you sort of break that down? Who would you include under that umbrella?
Yeah. The way I see it currently is there is this spectrum within the larger Catholic perspective on the church today. And on the one side, you have the sedevacantists who have decided that basically the church has defected and therefore the offices are vacant. And so they've come to this conclusion through their own interpretation of tradition. And so they're very similar to Protestants. The only difference being is that they also have tradition, but it's a tradition that's interpreted by their own means, through their own investigation. And so that's the one extreme, and they are not within the visible structure of the church. They do not commune with the church. This is objectively a sin of schism. Now,
Mhm.
internally, you cannot judge anyone's guilt. You don't know the factors that are at play, but objectively, there is a status of schism here. And
Mhm.
so, uh, morally speaking. And so, and then you have the Society of St. Pius X, which also has its own splinter groups. But the largest group right now basically is united in rejecting the aspects of the Second Vatican Council, including aspects of the magisterium of the modern popes. And they have been excommunicated, but that excommunication was lifted for ecumenical reasons.
Mhm.
But the fact of the matter is that they are not within the juridical structure of the church. They do not have a canonical mission, which means that they're outside of the visible juridical bounds of the Catholic Church, and
Mhm.
that to adhere to their position is also to adhere, morally speaking, to a schismatic stance. And so that is a danger that we need to avoid. But also, so then I would say there are those within the juridical structure of the church
Mhm.
that go to mass and to the sacraments by priests who do have a juridical status and they do have mission from the church, but they still harbor this mindset of suspicion or even some rejection, despite being within the bounds of the church, of the Second Vatican Council and of the magisterium of the popes. And then finally, I would say you have people who realize that the situation is not that simple, that obedience can come hand in hand with an acknowledgement of the failings of the Catholic Church,
Mhm.
and who support and who love the Second Vatican Council, have critiques about the Second Vatican Council as well as critiques about other councils in the history of the church,
Sure.
because we know, to be consistent is to say, yes, a council is never going to be perfect. It's not scripture, but
Right.
it had something to say, and we ought to listen to what the church has told us and work with that and move forward. And so, and the magisterium, especially of Pope Saint John Paul II, the number of encyclicals he has promulgated,
Mhm.
they read these with devotion, with submission of intellect and will,
Right.
and so yeah. And finally, then I would say you have the progressive Catholic who thinks the church began in 1965,
Mhm.
interprets the council not in continuity with the past, and who thinks that we are moving forward towards an acceptance of gay marriage, contraception, all the progressive talking points, women priests, and that we are updating things, and finally we've made progress. And that's the spectrum, really. And the only consistent position is the traditional ecclesiological position, which is that you cannot reject the council and you must interpret it in light of tradition, taking into consideration the theological notes, as well as what the church has been saying since the council. So that's the spectrum that I see.
Yeah, that's pretty wide. And there are those who say, "Well, come on, guys. Who do you think you are? Why are you picking on traditionalists when you have, you have the German bishops and the German clergy. You have these liberals
Mhm.
running around, some of whom have high appointments within the juridical structure of the church. And here you
Mhm.
guys are picking on quote unquote trads.
Mhm.
Um, let's make it clear that we're not judging any particular soul.
Mhm.
This isn't about that. It's not, oh, a trad was mean to you, Dom, and now you have a bone to pick, so you're going to get even by doing the work that you do.
Yes.
This is about assessing objective stances, using the church's magisterium as the yardstick and the criterion to see where they fall. So
Yes.
this is about being as objective as possible. And of course, some of the nicest people I know are traditionalists. So I mean, I think a lot of this too comes from online,
Yes.
um, unfortunately, and it's not easy to ignore an online presence because everybody's on social media these days. So of course, a lot of the stuff you're gonna get is from that sphere.
Mhm.
Nevertheless, they have quite a loud presence, quite a big presence online. But I'm sure you've encountered these types in real life as well. This isn't just some sort of boogeyman, some nebulous boogeyman. These problems are real. These attitudes are real.
Mhm.
and we have to address them. Like,
Yeah.
would you say there's a sense in which some strands of traditionalism might be as dangerous, if not more, than liberalism? Because at least the liberals are honest. They're an open book. You know where they stand. But traditionalists, some of them, are using the guise of tradition, holy tradition, but they're actually causing more damage because they're trying to operate from the inside under the
Yes.
guise of piety and tradition, which it causes a lot more confusion. At least with liberals, you know where they stand right off the bat, so there is no
Mhm.
confusion. Would you say that's somewhat accurate?
Yeah, I think you're hitting it on the head. I would say, unfortunately, and people may not be happy with this, but unfortunately, my experience tells me that it is not just online, and
Hmm.
it is in fact rampant. Again, I do account for people like the I moved away from my views thanks to a traditionalist community. I am
Right.
not discounting that reality, but the fact of the matter is, it is a majority and it is not just online. And people need to know this. And that's a problem. Now, people are going to be mad at me. I've been called a Freemason, I've been called a modernist. Uh, Look, I've grown up in these circles. This is all I've known. And there is a disdain for the Second Vatican Council, and it is the majority view. Um, Now, again, I'm accounting, especially in diocesan parishes that offer the traditional Latin Mass, that is much less present. And that was the way forward.
Hmm.
But things have changed. And so, but what I would say about why the traditionalist and why not the German bishops, I do talk about the German bishops, and
Yeah.
I plan on talking more about the German bishops. I plan on doing an entire show on the German bishops. But you do not discriminate when it comes to error. Error is error and it ought to be called out. And you're right, there is a certain level here of perniciousness because it's under the guise of all the smells and bells and fancy, awesome traditional stuff that we are actually pushing, in fact, a modernist ecclesiology that leads you straight out of the Catholic Church. And what I would
Mm.
say is that traditionalism of the type I'm speaking of is liberalism. The difference, substantially, there's no difference. Accidentally, absolutely, there's a difference. They just
Right.
choose different, different details to focus on. But in the name of resisting modernism, people have landed right back into modernism. And so
Yeah.
the real question is, are the traditionalists resisting modernism, or is it more complicated and more interesting than that? And what I discovered is that it is. And when I started reading across the board, I again, generalizations are never helpful, but for the sake of ease, I would say that I found a home in the communal school of theology. And I
Hmm.
do, take from other areas, but in it, I found a vibrant, full, vast, and beautiful traditional, but seeking to move forward understanding of the church and of tradition and of the magisterium.
Mm.
But and people will say, well, what about St. Thomas? Well, St. Thomas is part of they draw upon St. Thomas in the communal school. And
Right.
so, but also, I read the commentatorial Dominican tradition, as I've been reading them a lot more recently, and it's funny because it's from that tradition that I'm getting a lot of these principles that show that the ecclesiology that is in fact being adhered to is not traditional. So that's how I see it. Does that make sense?
It does, and I've often thought about this. The irony of it all is, so for some Protestants, right, they believe there was a time in which the church was pure, but at some point she went off the rails
Hmm.
and went into some sort of apostasy. And there's all these conspiracy theories, the trail of blood, whatever, whatever.
Hmm.
Common in a lot of fundamentalist Protestant evangelical circles.
Hmm.
What I found is that, objectively speaking, there seems to be a similar narrative among some traditionalists, i.e., the church has gone off the rails. So it's no different substantively than what the Protestants are saying, but the only difference is the time frame.
Hmm.
The Protestant might say, well, the Council of Nicaea, Constantine, created the Catholic Church or whatever. But here we have, on the other hand, somebody else saying the church went off the rails, but not until the 1960s or 1970. So it's
Yes.
substantively the same, ecclesiological narrative, but it's just the time frame is shifted.
Absolutely. You're on the dot. I mean, that's exactly it. What we're looking at is a Protestant ecclesiology. And so the way I see it is that many traditionalists have Lutheritis, right? As another person once put it. And, you know, so when there's corruption and crisis in the church, what a good, healthy reform within the church does is it leans on the authoritative teachings of the magisterium to push for that reform. But what the Protestant revolt or Reformation, however you want to call it, what it did, and unfortunately what we're seeing here with the traditionalist movement, is that it basically tries to reform things, but not from the authoritative magisterium, but from somehow a appeal to the past that ignores the living voice of the church, and that comes from an ecclesiology. It may not be explicitly known by the proponent, but it's implicitly there. It comes from an ecclesiology that is fundamentally Protestant and that denies the continuity of the visibility of the church. And St. Robert Bellarmine would have had nothing to do with this, nor St. Francis de Sales. And that's really what did it for me, is seeing this fundamentally ecclesiological divorce.
Hmm.
And that's really the crux of it. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Vatican I said, paraphrasing, that there will never be a time in which the successor of Peter is not governing the church. This is a perpetual promise. Um, Christ has given us his stamp of approval and said, "The gates
Mhm.
of hell will not prevail against the church. I will be with you till the end of the age." So this is a perpetual promise of protection from
Mhm.
Christ via the Holy Spirit. So to say that, the see is vacant, or um, the see of Rome has been a see of pestilence for half a century, it just doesn't fit. Once you've conceded that, it seems that you've implicitly, because I know that's not the intention, but implicitly
Mhm.
denied the indefectibility of the church. And once you've done that, there's no point in being Catholic. I mean, we can just pack up and go home and join some other communion.
Yes. In fact, I mean, this is what tunnel vision inevitably does. It's comfortable and it's easy to build a certain kind of ideological bubble, and people are not going to be happy with me saying, using those types of words, but it's been my experience that when you build a comfortable bubble around yourself, and that bubble is challenged, you have an existential crisis, and you end up either changing the way you see things or leaving the church. And we see this. I mean, Skojek, Dreyer, what's his name? Yeah, Dreyer,
Dreher, yeah.
and Cambia. This is what happened: is that they saw corruption, they saw chaos, and they threw the towel and they left.
Hmm.
And it's because so I mean, there's so many things to say here. If you look at uh, the idea that the sea could be vacant, right? It implies this kind of divorce between the fundamentally Thomistic principle, which you got from Aristotle, of hylomorphism, which is this idea that
Hmm.
you can't have matter without form when it comes to an existent, something that exists in real life.
Right.
And so if you think about it, let's say you think of the concept of matter. What do you think of? Dirt. Okay, well,
Hmm.
that's dirt. It's got the dirt form. So if you take away form, matter is pure potential. And so you can't have a seat that is vacant in a certain sense when it comes to the continuity of the visibility of the church through history. Because if that seat continues to be vacant, then in other words, what you're saying is that there is no visible structure to the church, because you can't have matter without form. And so that's the fundamental problem with the sedevacantist position. But also, the thing is, Pope Francis, he has, there's a certain sense in which his audience, like the people who listen to him, right?
Hmm.
It's a universal audience. It
Right.
has a massive scope. And because of the modern media nowadays, the spotlight is on him. We know everything almost about what he's doing, saying. We might
Hmm.
even know what he ate for breakfast. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
exaggerating, but the point being is that at one point you're going to have the French that are happy, and then the Africans are unhappy. Then you have the Americans that are happy, but then the Greeks that are unhappy. The fact of the matter is, if you have this tunnel vision of American Catholicism and traditionalism, then the moment that a pope from Argentina, first of all, who is legislating with certain exceptions in mind, because his sympathies lie with people in strange circumstances. That bubble of North American Catholic traditionalism bursts, while at the same time there's other people in Argentina or in Africa who are like, thank God, or the Greeks with his synodality of the church, they're happy with that. And
Right.
so the thing is, you have to take a step back out of the bubble and look at things as a whole. And there's always going to be parts of the church that are unhappy because of the universal scope of of the very audience that the Pope has. And so it's
Mm.
just, it's complicated. It's not
Very
that
much
simple.
so. Yeah, but that's a great
Yeah.
point. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want the position of being the universal pastor and
Yeah. No.
supreme pontiff. No way. I couldn't handle it for 1 second. So,
Yeah.
we should all, regardless of how we feel about this pontificate, we should all fast and pray, offer
Yes.
rosaries and mass intentions and our sacrifices and pains
Hmm.
and joys for the Holy Father, and St. Peter's prayers for him, because he definitely needs them. He's in his
Hmm.
80s. He can hardly walk. I sympathize with him because I have cerebral palsy, so I understand what it's like to have
Hmm.
limited mobility and yet still have a task or many tasks to do. It can be tough.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my heart goes out to him sometimes. Seeing him feeble like that. Um, but okay, so let me ask you this: the Second Vatican Council,
Hmm.
what what precipitated Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre's reaction against it? Like what happened here? What's the story in brief?
Yeah. Real quick, but before I do my best to answer that, I just wanted to point out, because I've received these criticisms. It's not because of what I just said that somehow suddenly uh, people who take the position I take are naive hyper papalists.
Yeah.
So I just want to point that out, because there always can be critiques and criticisms of a pontificate. That is not, it's not outside of the scope of what I'm saying. Anyway, I just wanted to add that. But
Yeah. Let me
yeah.
let me just tack onto that real quick, Dom.
Hmm.
Um so this idea that we're all ultramontanists and we think every word that the Pope utters is gospel truth and he can do no
Hmm.
wrong. Far be it from us to believe such a thing, because
Yeah.
that would be heresy.
It'd be
Um,
idolatry. Yeah.
yes, exactly. We're not papalaters.
No.
My position is that the Holy Father has not taught heresy in his magisterium. He's not a heretic. Has he done questionable things, said questionable things that can be critiqued in charity first and foremost, respectfully by virtue of his
Hmm.
office? Yes, absolutely. And you know what?
Yeah.
If those things are damaging to some people, those people need to have their concerns heard and addressed.
I
That's
completely
all.
agree with you.
It is right and just. Yeah,
Yes.
that's absolutely the case. So
Amen.
we're not the type. We're not the hyper papalists. Pontificates can and should, in some instances, be critiqued, but in the proper in the appropriate manner through the appropriate channels.
Yes, and this is another thing. A lot of the concerns of the traditionalist are legitimate concerns
Hmm.
that I share, but the problem is, because of the misbehavior of some, now we can't even address those concerns. And so it's a cross that now we have to bear. But I'm gonna stay home, but I'm upset because we could have settled this. We could have talked about it. And now, our dad came down saying enough is enough. I'm sick of the bickering. And it's annoying because we could have had something fruitful here. And I would argue we did have a lot of fruitful dialogue. I mean, a lot of the cross fertilization that Pope Benedict called for did in fact happen in many areas. I
Hmm.
see it every Sunday. But anyway, that's that. But to answer what you said about Archbishop Lefebvre, I think the best way to approach that situation is to kind of take a step back and understand the council itself.
Hmm.
Um, there's this idea that before the council, everything was great. The vocations were booming. Tradition was upheld, and then the council happened, and the church defected, and then the vocations were gone, and relativism, false ecumenism, a lot of that's true, but it's a false narrative. There's a lot of half truths there. I would recommend any viewer to go to Joseph Ratzinger's article prior to the council called "The New Paganism in the Church." And the fact of the matter is, because of secular bourgeois European culture, and this was in fact in America as well,
Hmm.
the faith had, to put it basically, things that were ultimate became penultimate. This I got that expression from Dr. Larry Chapp. I think it's a great way to summarize it. We had lost our eschatological edge, right? And
Mhm.
so what happened was,
Sorry
um,
about that. Someone's yelling in the background. I'm
oh, you're
outside right
fine.
now, so I
Oh, I
apologize.
see. Oh, it's totally fine, totally fine. Um, yeah, so I think that the church discovered that she needed reform in certain areas. And so
Mhm.
for me, a big part of this process was to ask myself, what are those areas? And so I dug deep and I found them. And so I think when it comes to Archbishop Lefebvre, is first of all, he was in Africa most of the time doing great missionary work. He wasn't, and also, the way he was raised and in a very devout Catholic family. Um, I think that uh, he wasn't aware of the larger picture that some of these other great Catholics were speaking of. And I think that's part of what he saw at the council was an unneeded reform that was in fact very much so needed. And I could go through them if you want, but
Yeah,
what the
yeah.
council sought to do, um,
Absolutely. I think that would be helpful because, people
yeah,
think of, the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, but they can't really pinpoint them. So if you can't pinpoint them, well, how can you say they're necessary or even good?
yeah. No, absolutely. Okay, well, the first thing I would point to is there was an overemphasis on the Petrine structure of the church at the expense of the Marian dynamism of the church. And the reason for this is because when the church faces a crisis, she needs to defend the deposit of faith. And at the Protestant Reformation, she faced a crisis that unfortunately is very similar to the ecclesiology that the traditionalists hold to, which is a downplay of the Petrine structure of the church in favor of the Marian dynamism. And so this idea that the church is ultimately, we hold on to the true faith despite these defecting, bishops and pope. And so what happened was that Saint Robert Bellarmine developed and emphasized the visibility of the church in response to the Protestant problem. And he did so beautifully. He did so in a very articulate and wonderful way, and the church held on to that, rightfully so, and thank God for that. But what happened is that subsequently, after Saint Robert, as things developed, theology became that which is not Protestant, and same on the Protestant side, that which is not Catholic. And
Hmm.
so the emphases shifted, where now ecclesiology was purely Petrine and structural, and the Marian and the Eucharistic aspects
Hmm.
became somewhat they became secondary, and so what the council sought to do is to restore the primacy of the Marian with the indispensable importance of the Petrine to protect the Marian. And so that's a
Mm.
huge aspect of what Lumen Gentium is on about. That's just one thing. I mean, the next thing that well, this plays into the Novus Ordo itself, actually. But
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah, it
I
sounds like
just,
you had a
yeah, no, I was just thinking about, there's a saying, ad jessam per Mariam cum petro. It's
yeah,
very apt, right, for
exactly.
this. Um, yeah, the
Yeah.
Novus Ordo. I'm really interested of your take on that because I've read Jungmann and
Yeah.
the history of the Roman Rite, and again, I wasn't expecting to find some of the things that I found. Um,
Mhm.
in particular, communion in the hand being the standard East and West until the ninth century, like that just blew me
Yeah.
away. But then
Yeah.
again, people will say, "Oh, he was a modernist," or "You have to be careful with him," just because he said those things, just because he
There's no
called a
true
spade a spade.
Scotsman.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what were you going to say about something playing into the Novus Ordo?
Yeah, well, my list here is too large, but to speak of the Novus Ordo, uh, there's a criticism levied against the Novus Ordo that it eclipses the ministerial priesthood and kind of establishes this egalitarian priestly celebration where everybody's up at the altar waving their hands and confecting the Eucharist, right?
Right.
And and
Yeah.
the fact of the matter is that we did see stuff like that, right?
Right. Right.
But what the traditionalists will say, aha, this is because of the council. They're emphasizing the priesthood of the lay people. Well, here's the thing: prior to the council, because of the secularism that we lived in, and secularism has it has a genealogy. It stems out of the Protestant Reformation. a lot there. But what I'm trying to say is that what developed is a kind of cultural metaphysics of competition, which means that when you have, for example, when the priesthood of the ministerial, the priesthood of the minister is spoken of, and the priesthood of the layperson is spoken of, then we're speaking of the same thing. They're on equal planes. Because if they're not, then there's competition. And we can't have competition, because if you have competition, then the layperson loses any kind of priestly status in virtue of their baptism. And it's
Right.
just the ministerial priest. But Catholic metaphysics focuses on participation, where you
That's
can
right.
have difference without competition because of participation. And
Yeah.
one of the huge issues that the council is seeking to address is the participation of lay people in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And so what we saw after the council was because of the culture, not because of the council, which sought to help and remedy the problems in the culture. And that's a microcosm of the macrocosmic issue that we're dealing with here. So
Mm.
that's just one aspect. That's how I see it.
Yeah, you talk about participation. I mean, that's the whole reason salvation is theosis, because
Yes,
we participate in
exactly.
the divine nature without losing our identity or what we are ontologically.
Mhm,
And so there's no difference in saying, I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas says, the only true priest is Christ, all others are his ministers. You
mhm,
could apply that to obviously the hierarchy, primarily, but the
mhm.
lay people, by virtue of their baptism, were baptized into Christ, and so we participate in the priesthood of Christ, albeit not in the
Absolutely.
full ministerial sense. So we're all priest, prophet, and king by virtue of our baptism, and I think we need to recover that. In a sense, I think that's been
Yes.
lost.
And it's the fact that that's been lost. See, that goes hand in hand with what we saw before the council, which is a divorce in between moral theology and spiritual theology. Moral theology became what they call deontological, which is merely following the rules because you must, as opposed to teleological, following them because they lead to happiness. This is where the
Mhm,
the Sermon on the Mount comes into play, and the gifts of the Spirit, which is part of spiritual theology. So that divorce created a kind of elitism where the lay people followed moral theology, but the mystics and the monks and the hermits followed spiritual theology. And so
mhm,
it goes hand in hand with the council's call for universal holiness and St. John Paul II's theology of the body, which focuses on the vocation of the married life. And I mean,
mhm,
this is what the council sought to do. And those who reject the council reject the reforms, and what you see in their ranks is a preconciliar form of Catholicism that still needs reform. They need the council. They need
mhm.
to listen to her, to the
Yeah.
church.
And I
So,
think, we you talked earlier about consistency when talking about councils.
mhm,
People say, well, stop using the excuse that Vatican II hasn't been properly implemented. It's a failure, should kick it to the curb. But if we look at every council throughout church history, 50 years for supreme implementation is nothing.
mhm,
I
yeah,
mean, Nicaea didn't stamp out Arianism for hundreds of years. So if
nope,
we're going to
yeah,
use Vatican II as the yardstick, then Nicaea was an utter failure. But
absolutely,
that's the thing, and within the wider purview of the church,
mhm,
time is long. But from our perspective, we want things right away. The church doesn't move like that. The Holy Spirit doesn't work like that. Um,
yeah,
what I wanted to ask you is about the Novus Ordo. There's some claims floating around that, it's, well, basically the architect was Bugnini, and he
mhm,
was a Freemason, and the whole thing is they wanted to Protestantize the liturgy. So you had what Sacrosanctum Concilium says about the liturgy, but then after
mhm,
the council, you have these like side councils or para councils that,
mhm,
the prelates got sort of in bed with Protestant ministers and said, "Hey guys, how can we make this more palatable to you?" And it's basically a Protestant Catholic hodgepodge of a liturgy.
yeah.
What would you say to that claim?
I would say the number one person to turn to when it comes to liturgy in this area, in this discussion, is the great Louis Bouillet, a
Mm,
French convert from Lutheranism who became Catholic and who was present at the council, helped with Sacrosanctum Concilium, and was on the Concilium group that helped put together the Novus Ordo Missae. Uh, so I would say that fundamentally the critique is the downplay of the sacrificial aspect of the mass, and
mhm,
how that's basically conceding ground to the Protestants, and then the SSPX will go on to say, therefore, there is positive heresy contained in the Novus Ordo Missae. It's a danger to souls. It's a valid mass that is illicit, and the Church has basically defected because it's promulgated something harmful to souls in liturgy, and that is completely untraditional. That is modernist to
Isn't that
hold
a
to that position.
theological, like an actual
It
theological error that's
absolutely
been
is.
censored?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and I would recommend a video by Michael Lofton on that very topic that goes into depth as to how that is completely inconsistent and falls under censor. Yes, um, but when it comes to this so-called supposed Protestantization of the liturgy, again, it was taking a step back and looking at the trajectory of the church and understanding that she didn't leave sacrificial language on the wayside to please in a relativistic way the Protestants. What
Mm,
she did is she maintained uh, the truth of that sacrificial aspect, but contextualized it and coded it in a older patristic and fuller understanding of the Paschal mystery. The reason why there was an emphasis on the sacrificial aspect is the same reason why there was an emphasis on the visible structure of the church. It was a way to combat the errors of Protestantism. But the church has a new mission today, a different mission, because the times have changed, and she wants to present not just an apologetic, not just a response, but a positive exposition of the fullness of what she is to the world. And that is the entirety of the Paschal mystery presented and represented for the sake of our salvation. And that's what the
mhm.
the missal does. And this idea about Bunini, so, first of all, there is no concrete evidence that he was somehow a Freemason. There is suggestive evidence that he was a suspicious and shady guy, right? I
Right.
mean, so that's undeniable, I would say. But the thing is, again, consistency is key. If you apply this criteria to the church's history, we have a lot of shady people
Mhm.
involved in promulgating legislation from the church. And secondarily, I would say that this idea that this one man was able to fully control the subsequent changes to the Novus Ordo Missae is just not realistic. And so there's all those things to be taken into consideration. I think that the Novus Ordo Missae is a beautiful, it can be celebrated beautifully. I
Sure.
don't think it was exactly what the Council of Fathers had in mind, but it isn't not that either. And providence accounts for failures of prudence or omission. But at the end of the day, the faith is secure, the liturgy is secure, and it is not a harm to souls. And if we say that, we are calling into question the promises that Christ made to his church.
Correct. And I mean, when
Yeah.
we say danger to souls, we're not just speaking of, oh, it hurts your disposition when you're at mass and your ability to appreciate truth, goodness,
Hmm.
and beauty, something like that's subjective to the Eucharistic recipient. It's more,
Hmm.
it's a danger to souls in the sense that if you participate in this, you can go to hell.
Exactly. Yeah. It's it's
That's what
it's
it means.
yes. That's exactly the position the society holds, is that this will harm your faith. This is, it could be a sin to go to the Novus Ordo Missae, is what they're saying.
Yeah, you had another video with John Salza and Andrew Bartel about the SSPX and how they have in their examination of conscience, have I attended a
Mhm.
Novus Ordo Missae? So that right there tells
Yeah.
you that if you do so willingly, with full knowledge, you're actually sinning. You're
Yes.
sinning by attending the representation of the sacrifice of Christ upon the altar. If you can even wrap your head around that,
As
see,
promulgated by the church.
yeah, not the low-hanging fruit, the abusive stuff. I mean, one YouTube commentator looked at a mass that took place out in the ocean with the life raft
Right.
as the altar and said, "This is what Vatican II calls for."
No.
No, that's a straw man if I've ever seen one. They're talking.
Yeah.
So if you want to attack the Novus Ordo Missae, attack St. John Cantius in Chicago. That's a harm to souls, is what they're saying.
Yes. Yep. That's right. That's
That's
why this is
incredible.
problematic. And this needs to be called out. Why are you calling out the trads, not the libs? Is what they tell me, right? No one's calling out this stuff. Like, when's the last time you heard this? I mean, when it comes to specifically the position on the Novus Ordo Missae, like I remember people being shocked within the last few months in discovering this online. So yeah, definitely.
We have a question. I was actually going to bring this up before I brought up
Okay.
the life raft incident from Father John. Would you or Dom agree that Novus Ordo prayers sound closer to a return to early church language? Did ressourcement theology override medieval theological language? I'll briefly comment, and then I'll let you take over, Dom.
Sure.
So, Father, I do think that the intention behind the promulgation of the Novus Ordo was precisely that, a return to a more patristic, early patristic liturgy. I think that was the intent. I don't think it was something nefarious or scandalous. I think the intentions were good. However, the counterpoint to that would be, well, don't be what's the word? Don't be antiquarian.
Yeah.
If you're trying, the church is moving has moved forward. Why are you trying to go back to the third or fourth century? We've moved past that with good reason. There are reasons
Hmm.
why we did what we did with the Tridentine liturgy. Don't leave good enough alone.
Hmm.
So there's that sort of counterpoint, but I do think that whole resource movement, I mean, it can be taken to extremes where you neglect the medieval theologians, and it should be a synchronicity and harmonization. Ideally, that's what it should do. That's how the church would view it, because it wouldn't say, oh, go back to the fathers and just toss St. Thomas Aquinas in the garbage can. No, you would have to find a synthesis. So how would you comment on that, Don?
Yeah. I mean, thanks for the question, Father. Appreciate it. I would say that the Ressourcement project is heavily characterized by its return to the fathers, yes, but it involves the medievals
Hmm.
because there was a distancing, a kind of commentary on commentary on commentary within this, only Saint Thomas, Bonaventure, not so much, Scotus, not at all. And so, in the Ressourcement project, there's a return to the sources, and that includes Bonaventure, Thomas, and Scotus. And so theologically, that's what I would say. It's more expansive than that, but there is a huge priority given to the fathers due to, I mean, because we show deference to our elders, and also because they're closest to the New Testament. But when it comes to the liturgy, the reason the logic behind the ressourcement movement in liturgy was a return to something prior in certain instances for the sake of a new circumstance. So it's the very reason that the church moved in a certain direction after the Middle Ages or during the Middle Ages. That same reason is the reason why we are also now retrieving older things, because the circumstances call for a different approach to a changing world, but it's all taken from the bosom of the tradition of Holy Mother Church. So this charge of antiquarianism, you know, it's a real thing. Like, antiquarianism is a real thing, but I do
Hmm.
not believe that what the council is doing is antiquar or the Novus Ordo Mise. Although I have reservations about certain like minor aspects, you might say, nothing
Hmm.
like what the SSPX is saying.
Accidental aspects.
Sure, yeah, things could be better, of course. I mean, I would say the same thing of the 1962, but we're so smart. It's not what it's doing in the liturgy is not antiquarianism. It's doing the exact same thing that was done when the liturgy moved in the very direction that led to the Tridentine Mass. It's speaking to the world and to the way we should worship today and to us today, not to us back during the post-Tridentine era. So I hope that helps. Yeah.
Yeah, the Holy Spirit moves the church with the times, not in the sense of being of the world, but
Yes.
being able to be in the world and not of it, and speak to it authoritatively,
Yeah.
to
That that that
to
yeah.
the world. Yeah.
But that's the problem. What had happened is that the church was speaking, but no one was listening or understanding. She wasn't speaking to the people of today. She was speaking to the people of yesterday. And it doesn't mean you change what you say, but you change the way you speak because you're speaking to someone new, someone who has a different language.
Right.
So, yeah.
And what surprised me when I read Jungmann, I mentioned communion in the hand, but
Mhm.
also, if you look at some of the early liturgies, he mentions how first and foremost, at the earliest stages, an altar was a movable wooden table with
Mhm.
covered with a cloth, and then a simple stone slab.
Mhm.
So, sometimes the Novus Ordo gets critiqued. Look at the simplicity. There's no ornate high altar, and so it's somehow deficient. But in the
Mhm.
early church, things were very simple, you know.
Yeah.
And and he says also that versus populum and ad orientem were celebrated side by side at an early stage in Rome, of all places.
Hmm.
which is interesting as well. So I mean, I think we have rose-colored glasses when we look at the liturgy and its development. I mean,
Hmm.
I think we just need to inform ourselves on church history and as far as the liturgy goes, and we won't be so quick to have rash judgment
Yes.
or conclusions
Yes. I personally am a huge proponent of Ad Orientem, and I do wish we would retrieve that
for
for many
theological reasons. Yeah.
for theological reasons that Ratzinger brings up. But I mean, some people are of mind that it's somehow like sinful or abhorrent to face the people. That's just extreme. That's just not how things work.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if more priests were maybe told, ad orientem has nothing to do with you turning your back on the congregation, but we're facing east together, anticipating the parousia of Christ because he returns like lightning from the east. I think,
Yeah, it's a catechetical issue. Yeah,
catechetical issue. Yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
So yeah, the Novus Ordo is interesting, and there's varying opinions on it. It
Hmm.
could be celebrated better. We're not saying that
Yeah,
all
definitely
celebrations are equal. I think we have a lot of work to do in that area for obvious reasons.
agreed.
But if
Yeah.
we're talking about its promulgation as as it was originally promulgated, I mean,
Hmm.
if it was done in that way, it would look very similar to a TLM in many respects.
Oh yeah, yeah. I
And
completely agree.
for the Holy Father's obviously gotten a lot of flack for Traditionis Custodes, and I get it.
Hmm.
I think the biggest collateral damage with that ruling are Catholics who love the TLM and are obedient to the living magisterium. I think they
Yes.
got kind of railroaded by this document, and they're the collateral damage. But I
Hmm.
think at the same time, the Holy Father wasn't pulling something out of his hat and
Nope.
looking at some imaginary enemy.
Hmm.
He was addressing a real problem that's rampant in the church. This isn't a small minority. This is a huge section of the church, particularly in North America. Because if you look at the church in the global
Yes.
south, she is exploding. She's
Yes.
making martyrs. The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. And look at Africa. How many martyrs are being produced on a daily basis? People are losing their
Hmm.
lives, dying for Christ, and they're being made saints and being fed on the Novus Ordo. So
It's
to say that the Novus Ordo can impart holiness or make saints is false.
it's our tunnel vision. We could learn a little bit of humility. Yes.
Father John has another comment. I'm just going to pull it up. Some post-Trent language seems like it's fighting early Protestantism. Yeah, that's why I ask. The
Yeah.
Novus Ordo
Yeah.
sometimes look like it's competing with modern Protestantism. Just something I noticed. So maybe the Tridentine liturgy was fighting with early Protestant Reformation type deal, and
Yes.
then the Novus Ordo is kind of fighting, or say competing with sort of the modern Protestant landscape. I've never thought of it that way.
Yeah. I don't know. The way I see it is that the intention behind the Novus Ordo Missae um, is to give us a sober, because the Roman Rite is characterized by its sobriety, its
Hmm.
simplicity, its elegance, its shortness, and so it's trying to give us this kind of sobriety. Also, it's trying to give us a plethora of texts from the tradition. Now, there is a case to be made over the fact that the priest can choose various options and it becomes kind of theatrical. I think that's a very legitimate criticism.
Absolutely.
Um, but I think the Novus Ordo Missae, the original intention and the attempt it's trying to do is to present a fuller liturgical theology, and so I'm kind of allergic to this hierarchicalization. That's not a word. I just made that up. But
Good one. Yeah.
but saying that there's more grace because of the subjective disposition that
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
TLM produces in you. Well, the fact of the matter is, sentire cum ecclesia is something that is going to give you more grace. So, I'm saying stop pitting either against each other,
Hmm.
and I think Pope Benedict's way of thinking about
I
this
was
is the
just
way
going
to
to bring
think
that
about
up.
this.
Yes, that was his
Yes.
position. Don't pit one against the other. No one mass provides more grace, objectively speaking, than another because
Hmm.
it's Christ's sacrifice. It's
Yeah.
perfect. It's supreme.
Hmm.
Now, can some liturgies better dispose certain types of people to participate more and see the Eucharist differently? Absolutely. So, I would say to somebody, if attending a Byzantine liturgy better
Yes.
disposes you, then
Hmm.
maybe that's your spiritual home. You don't necessarily have to go to a Novus Ordo parish. Go where you feel called. The difficulty is somebody saying, well, I feel called to a TLM, but now there are none in my area. So what would you
Yeah.
suggest somebody do in that situation? Like, rather than join the SSPX, for example, what should they do?
We've been punished because the younger brother couldn't um, obey. He couldn't behave, and it's not fair. And so, what does Christ tell us when things aren't fair? He says, "If you want to follow me, pick up your cross and follow me." And that stinks. I get it. Like I'm furious because I love the 1962. I think it needs reform. The way the 1969 is celebrated is hard for me sometimes. I'm right there with you. Um, but the fact of the matter is, you know, dad basically said enough is enough. And so everyone got punished. And we don't leave the household and run away because of that. What we do is we act like Christ. And so
Yeah.
I would say try to find one that's within the juridical structure of the church, permitted by the local ordinary, all of that stuff. If you can't, you know, uh, go to the Novus Ordo or find a Byzantine one or something. But at the end of the day, stay within Holy Mother Church, offer it up, and do your best. You can pray the old breviary if you want. I do think
Hmm.
there's something about the Roman Rite being united, though. So I would suggest going to the Novus Ordo, yeah, and just offer it up.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and that's exactly what I. You know what? It's funny you say that, because that was my solution. I don't know
Yeah.
if I mentioned this in our interview I did on your channel, but I almost
Mhm.
left for Eastern Orthodoxy
Mm.
in 2016 because I was so
Yeah.
incensed and furious at the way that the liturgy, or how I perceived the liturgy, was not being celebrated, what I
Mhm.
thought were abuses. So
Yeah.
sometimes I would leave the mass angry, foaming at the mouth, swearing, cussing, sinning in anger because of the celebration,
Yeah.
until a dear friend of mine said, you taught me about redemptive suffering. But he said, in your case, because I want to stop you from leaving Holy Mother Church, don't lose your salvation. He said, apply redemptive suffering to the liturgy.
Mhm.
So, for example, what I would do is, like, let's say a hymn came on that I wasn't particularly fond of. I
Mhm.
would offer it up and I would say, Lord, you know, this irritates me. However, there might be a member of the congregation that needs to hear a word or phrase from that hymn, and the Holy Spirit might prick them and nudge them and build them up and edify them. So if that's the case, use that to bless them. Or if Father makes a mistake, he has a hard job. I offer up my frustrations at his fumbles and foibles
Mhm.
for him and for his priesthood, because without him, I wouldn't have the Eucharist. I started saying, instead of flocking to a parish that's more what I perceive to be reverent, instead of
Mhm.
leaving and packing my bags, I decided, you know what? I'm going to be as reverent as I can where I'm planted. So what I
Mhm.
started doing was, for example, and I do this to this day, I hold prayer hands through the entire mass,
Mm.
except for the homily. And when the priest processes and recesses out of the church, I'll bow and make the sign of the cross as he passes me. And I'm doing these, and I used to receive kneeling and on the tongue without an altar rail. I don't do that anymore, mostly because of my physical shape and my limitations. But
Mm.
I do those things, and I did those things not to say, oh, look at me, look at how holy I am. It's twofold. Number one, I'm trying to remind myself, first and foremost, God have mercy on me, a sinner. I'm trying to dispose myself, remind myself that this is sacred space, this is holy ground. So how should I act in the presence of Christ?
Yeah.
How humble should I be? What bodily gestures and things can I do to remind myself, even though this isn't the most beautiful, architecturally speaking, church, what can I do to make myself better disposed and appreciate where I'm at?
Mhm.
Secondly, if that attitude rubs off on somebody else in the parish and it starts a domino effect, then praise God. That's not primarily why I'm doing what I'm doing, but if that's an
Yeah.
added effect and benefit, praise God. And also, I have a young family with little kids, and I want them to look up to Daddy and say, "Look at how Daddy is when he's at Mass." Like, for example, at an old parish I used to go to, they had the tabernacle to the side of the altar, and I had
Mhm.
little toddlers at the time. And before we left mass, I used to say, let's say bye to Jesus. So we'd kneel on the steps together, me and my little ones, and we'd say a prayer,
Yeah.
and they'd say bye to Jesus, see you next week. So Um, this kind of, and again, active participation, offering up my daily and weekly sufferings on the altar with Christ as part of the body of
Mhm.
Christ united to her head. That's active participation. That's what it's not. Let me sign up so I can wave as many felt banners as I can. That's not what active participation means. It means how can
Mhm.
we unite ourselves to the sacrifice upon the altar? How can we dispose ourselves to do that? So rather than leave the church, number one, and rather than leave to another parish that I liked more, this is the strategy that I adopted. I'm not saying that everybody needs to do this, but I'm saying that's, I think, the call that God has placed on my life spiritually based on my vocation as husband and father. This is what he wants me to do. This is what's best for my family. And so I
Mhm.
offer it up and I stay where I'm at. And I haven't, and you know what? The thing about it is, you want to talk about the fruits. Well, I could go to, and I've done this. I've gone to a
Mhm.
Latin mass and I felt very edified and fed after leaving. And there was one time when I stumbled into mass at my regular parish, and it was a school mass, right, with little kids.
Mhm.
Before, I would have got so angry that would have walked out. I wouldn't have stayed. But
Mhm.
I left the school mass in tears after receiving the Eucharist, and I was just as fed and edified as when I left the TLM. So this is
Mhm.
purely nothing of myself, but the grace of God poured on me to help live my vocation and offer my life as a sacrifice and united to the Mass. So this is maybe what can help somebody who's struggling. Like, I don't have a Latin Mass, but I don't want to leave the church. I want to stay in the Roman Rite. I don't want to change rites. What should I do? That's maybe a little suggestion that I can offer. Maybe try some of that and see if that helps you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And that's the thing. God is a good father. And sometimes, just as good fathers do, he takes away penultimate things to remind us of ultimate things. And that's how you have to
Mhm.
see it. That's it.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. So, um, I guess people rationalize Marcel Lefebvre's ordination of those bishops by saying, well, the church was in a state of emergency. Who
Yeah.
gets to determine that? That's not something that we can determine via private judgment, is it?
No, canon law is clear that the interpretation of a law it defers always to the legislator. I'm butchering that paraphrase, but the point being is that it's the legislator's interpretation that matters when it comes to canon law, and the church has been clear on her interpretation, and so it just doesn't hold up.
Yeah, and you guys mentioned in your podcast there about ministers united juridically to the structure of the church having mission, and those
Yes.
outside of that, like the SSPX, for example, lack mission. What does that mean exactly, and how does that factor into being united to the church or being outside of her visible bounds?
Yeah, I mean this is in the New Testament, and Saint Francis de Sales brings it up as well because of the issue of the Protestant Reformation. The idea being is that Christ is sent from the Father. He's sent on a mission, and the mission is to give us the good news. And with that comes all these gifts and these these privileges. And the chief one being salvation through the sacraments. And so just as Christ is sent by the Father, Christ, when he assumes into heaven with the Father, sends the Holy Spirit. And,
Hmm.
and so this is why when Christ tells the apostles that they can remit sins, he breathes on them. And he says, just as the Father sent me, I send you. And so the idea here being is that this starts within the internal life of God and goes ad extra into through
Hmm.
the incarnation, the extension of the incarnation, which is the church. And so uh, Peter being the first among equals, having the primacy, the juridical primacy, you know, union with him is paramount for the guaranteeing of the continuation of that mission. And so the juridical structure of the apostles underneath Peter, sent by Jesus, by the Spirit from Jesus and the Father, that is the mission we're talking about. Without that mission, there is no salvation. Outside of that structure, there is no salvation. Now, the church, explains that there's a difference between someone who steps out of that juridical structure and
Mm.
someone who is outside of it being beckoned in, and how grace works in those instances.
Okay.
That's different. What we're dealing with here is, unfortunately, an archbishop, bishops, and priests that have stepped outside of the juridical structure of the church, and without that mission, they cannot um, exercise it,
So
basically.
it's
And so
it's it's
that's
illicit.
it's illicit, exactly. There's a validity to most of their sacraments,
Sure,
uh,
sure.
but they're not licit. They don't have the permission. They don't have the mission.
So let me ask you this. Why is it that, and I think you might have an upcoming show on this, so I don't want to spoil it,
Yeah.
but why is
Okay.
it that even on Catholic Answers, and I was surprised to hear this from them, that
Yeah.
you can attend an SSPX chapel to fulfill your Sunday obligations. So if they're outside the juridical structure of the church, if they're not canonically in schism, although you could argue maybe morally, how is it that we could possibly fulfill our Sunday obligation? And what I guess what are the perks of that, and what are the drawbacks? What are the potential dangers of doing that?
I don't think you can. I think that should be changed
Okay, so you
because
think
of
that
what
was
you
an act
just
of
said.
mercy? Okay,
No, so I do think that Pope Francis granted, um, the necessary jurisdiction for confessions, and he also granted the necessary jurisdiction for the witnessing of marriages. Now, the priest has to ask the local ordinary, um, and out of mercy, but the saying of mass is still illicit, and
right.
so I want to be careful what I'm saying here because I don't want to spread false information. But the way I understand it right now is that it does not fulfill your Sunday obligation. And so, at least that's where consistency leads me until I can see further evidence and information. The way I see it is that going to an SSPX mass on Sunday does not fulfill your Sunday obligation.
Yeah, and I did I think I heard that on Catholic Answers. I believe there it might have been an article or a radio broadcast. If I
Yeah.
Catholic Answers, I have dear friends there.
I love
I
Catholic
love
answers.
them. Like I love
Yeah,
them to death. So if I
same.
am wrong or misspoke, I sincerely apologize, but I do remember
Yeah,
hearing that. So it kind of took me by surprise because I'm thinking,
yeah,
you know, you can't attend somewhere regularly and not be like the company you keep. It's the
yeah.
schismatic mentality, being against the living magisterium, being against the council. That's all that's going to rub off on you, even if your intention is, look, I'm just going there to raise my kids Catholic and go to a TLM. I don't care about being disobedient. You might say that, and that might be your intention, which is great, but
Mhm.
give it some years, give it some months, and you'll start to change. It's just by osmosis. I don't think there's any way to escape that because it's human nature.
I've seen it happen to friends of mine. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
Uh,
again, I don't want to lead anyone to error. If there's information out there that I don't have, I welcome it. But consistency calls me to say that you cannot, to fulfill your Sunday obligation, go to an SSPX mass.
so how do they see the Pope? So he validly occupies the chair, but for all intents and purposes, he's to be resisted or just ignored. Like what? How do they see the Pope? Like practically speaking.
Yeah, it's. I think who was it? Was it Father Cicada? I can't remember which priest it was, but he said that every traditionalist is deep down a sedevacantist. We just haven't all fully realized it yet. And so
Hmm.
so the point being is that they have this recognize and resist attitude towards the teaching office. And the arguments they would use is, has he spoken ex cathedra? What theological note is it on? But it is an attitude of recognize and resist. And so there is a denial of large aspects of the teaching office of the church, and that is wrong. It's a problem. You don't, again, Donum Veritatis covers this. There are instances when you can be like, okay, I'm not sure about that, but you take it through the proper channels. You can submit a dubia. There's ways to go about this. The saints are the perfect examples in these areas.
Hmm. What are some aspects of the Second Vatican Council that they might deem as well problematic to be charitable but
Yeah.
outright heretical? What would some of those aspects be?
Yeah, well, religious liberty is a big one, and there's also collegiality. To cover religious liberty, um, there's the way I've approached it is that there's several ways to resolve this, and I haven't fallen down on any one of these ways yet. I have a preference for one of them, but the first one is Dignitatis Humanae is indeed a reversal, because what the church taught in the past was of a theological note that was not under the charism of infallibility. And so some people will say the church has made a mistake and she's reversed that in Dignitatis Humanae. That's one way to approach it. Another way to approach it is to say dignitatis humanae is a continuity of the fundamental principle, but applied in a different historical context.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so that's another one. And then a third one, I think I said four, but there's three. A third one is that what you have in Dignitatis Humanae, if you distinguish between the power of the state and the power of the church, so the temporal power versus the spiritual power, then the religious liberty taught in Dignitatis Humanae is in full continuity with the religious liberty taught by Pope Leo XIII. So that's another way to resolve it. Now, Pope Benedict XVI called for people to work on this, to understand what is it that the council sought to say. And that's the attitude we should have. What is it what the council sought to say? And we work on it. We try to understand. We don't recognize and resist and have a hermeneutic of suspicion. And so that's for religious liberty. For collegiality, I said this before in another show, but this is one of the most traditional doctrines you get, and
Hmm.
John said the same thing as well. I mean, it's in the New Testament, and it's throughout the tradition. It's sometimes eclipsed because of the necessity of the Roman pontiff to step in for the sake of unity, but it's there throughout the entire tradition. And what it especially what you see is there's this harmony between Vatican I, the primacy, the infallibility, and the universal jurisdiction of the Roman pontiff, and then Vatican II, which it confirms the collegial authority and aspect of the church as well when it comes to the bishops and the role that they play in the life of the church. And
Right.
so what collegiality teaches is that the three munera, the gifts that you receive as a bishop, come from your ordination. And those three are to sanctify, to teach, and to govern. That comes from your ordination as a bishop. It doesn't come from the Pope. But to exercise those licitly must come from the Pope. You must be within the juridical
Mm.
structure of the church, because that's where you can be sent on the mission to exercise those gifts. And so that's how I see it right now. It's how I
Okay.
understand it currently. And so that's what the council sought to teach. So when a bishop is at a council, he's not a spectator, he's a judge. And what he says
Hmm.
matters. We see this in Acts 15. St.
Right.
James and St. Peter, this is a traditional doctrine. There's no heresy here.
Interesting. Do they have a problem with Nostra Aetate as well?
Yes. Yeah. Let me think. Well,
Uh,
they think there's some kind of religious relativism going on. Um,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, I would say you have to read the document for yourself. You have to see what it says. You have to interpret it in light of tradition. And I think that when it comes to Nostra Aetate, there needs to be an understanding that non-Catholic religions, non-Christian religions, are in a relationship of potency to the one true faith, which is the full actuality of man's religious aspiration towards the divine. It's a religious aspiration that can go nowhere unless grace breaks in and transforms it and heals and saves us.
Mhm.
But the thing is, the Catholic Church, the Catholic religion, is the full actuality of man's religiosity towards God in light of the
Right.
incarnation. All other religions, right? And Saint Justin Martyr would talk about certain pagan philosophers, their philosophies containing the semina verbi, the seeds of the word. They're in a
Yes.
relationship of potency, of being taken up by the Catholic Church, while you discard the bad and you keep the good. This has been the Catholic move, for ages. It's always been the way we've done things. And Nostra
Since
Aetate is us reaching out to that potential and trying to
yeah.
converse with them. Yeah. So
Yeah, and in the document, if I'm not mistaken, it quotes John 14:6, where Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me." So you
yeah.
gotta you gotta consider that. And number
Yeah.
two, I think it was Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was the prefect of the CDF, he issued a document called Dominus Jesus, which was like,
Dominus Jesus.
yeah, an expansion and an explication of Nostra Aetate. And the theology is beautiful. I mean, the whole thing is like, so religious relativism, the Vatican II Council never said that these religions in and of themselves are good, separate from the church or from Christ, because God is one, truth is one. So anything good, true, or beautiful you find in other philosophies or religion, it comes from Christ, disseminated in a mysterious way through the church, and it shines in otherwise dark places to bring them to the fullness of faith, to draw them into full communion. That's the whole point. So the goodness is not of these other paths in and of themselves. It's from Christ, through the church in a mystical way, the same way that people get saved outside of the visible bounds of the church in non-Christian religions. It's
Hmm.
possible for them to be saved, but their salvation still comes in a mysterious way from Christ through his mystical body, to which they become
Hmm.
united, even though they're not card-carrying members.
Yeah.
It's very
Yeah. Oh,
beautiful.
it's beautiful. There's a lot there. I did a video on no salvation outside the Catholic Church. It's actually a topic I want to delve deeper into as well. But I mean, this is another thing, which is there's these criticism levied against the council saying it's ambiguous. It's not clarified. This leads to religious relativism. And so, why doesn't the church clarify? The church has. It's been clarifying this.
Right.
Saint John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI have clarified this. And so it's just, at the end of the day, we are dealing with a culture problem, not what the church teaches problem.
Right.
Yeah.
And something that people bring up is the note on Lumen Gentium, where it talks about the theological note of the council. And
Yeah.
they quote the first part, or they reference the first part, which says, there's no dogmas defined in this council. So they say, oh, it's purely pastoral, we can reject it. But if you read the rest of the note, it literally says that this council, according to the mind of the church and the council
Yeah.
fathers, is binding on all of Christ's faithful. It literally says that in the note.
Hmm.
So you
Does
can't
this
just
mean
you
that?
can't reject
Yeah.
that.
No, of course not. This same, Pope Pius IX condemned this in his Syllabus of Errors. Does this mean that we suddenly reject all other councils that were merely pastoral? The Second Vatican Council was pastoral in its doctrine, and its doctrine was about the church's mission, which is pastoral. You can't separate them.
Yes, and there are infallible theological truths in Vatican II.
Yes,
It didn't,
absolutely.
or it's not valid because it didn't pronounce any anathemas. There's that too.
Hmm.
There are councils that didn't issue anathemas. Are they not valid?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so somebody says, well, look, that's all well and good, but like John Paul II, look at Assisi, it was a disaster. Look at Pope
Uh,
Francis'
yeah.
recent visit to Canada. Like, what if they just say, look, I want to be obedient, I want to be in the church, but I can't take this stuff. Like, what would you say to them?
The not differentiating. So first of all, the Assisi question, Andrew and I covered some of it in our latest episode. We'll talk more about it in some future contents, but it's not as simple as some people think. But what I would say is that let's say it was something problematic and wrong, and John Paul II hopefully repented. If that's the position taken, then this idea that we should not differentiate between the sins of persons and the teachings of the church is a Protestant objection. And
Hmm.
we know better than that as Catholics. And so, what do we do in the face of crisis? What Jesus did. That's the only answer. And if we have to become comfortable with discomfort, or else we're not going to survive in this world.
Yeah, like our
So,
faith is one of tension. I mean, and that's built around the incarnation. God and man, tensions held together. That's how our
yes,
faith is. That's how our spiritual life is. It's very incarnational in that aspect.
yes.
And I brought up to you privately, Dom, a revelation that came to me, not spiritual. I didn't hear God's voice, but something I stumbled across
Yeah.
was in Francis Cardinal Arinze's autobiography. I believe it's called "The Man of His Word."
Hmm.
And we all know the Orthodox prelates can be found in Africa. They don't play. They don't mess around. But I
Yeah.
was very surprised to see him. He had a whole section on Assisi, and
Mm,
Francis Cardinal Arinze championed Assisi. He
mm,
was one of its architects. He had a hand in it, and he said what actually happened. Like, the intention behind it was good and pure. What
hmm,
happened practically was just miscommunication, misunderstanding. So nobody knew, for example, that a
hmm.
Buddhist was going to place a statue of Buddha on the Eucharistic altar. That was a mistake. It just happened spontaneously. It wasn't pre-planned. So
Yeah.
some logistic mistakes were made. But Francis Cardinal Arinze championed Assisi, and he defended
Hmm.
Pope Saint John Paul the Great, and that shocked me coming
Yeah.
from an African prelate. I really wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and there's so much that can be said about the Catholic Church's self-understanding and its understanding of other religions, especially in a modern context. I mean, there's a reason why John Locke, when he spoke of tolerance of religion, apply this to all religions except for the Catholic Church. He said, no, we cannot tolerate the Catholic Church because she does not understand herself the way these other religions understand themselves. And so, and this ties into religious liberty. It's I would recommend any viewer, if you want to go deep into how the church understands herself in the modern world when it comes to its relationship to the state and to other religions. D.C. Schindler has a great book called The Politics of the Real, The Church Between Integralism and Liberalism. And that really helped me see things in a new light, and approach these things with more nuance and with a larger mindset, not a
Hmm.
tunnel vision. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very important. So, I asked you this on Reason and Theology, but I'm
Hmm.
going to ask you again here.
Okay.
So, somebody says, Pope Benedict, Pope Saint John Paul the Great, they were Orthodox. Although, Assisi, let's just brush that to the side. They were Orthodox.
Yeah.
Francis is just a heretic. The things that he says and does,
Yeah.
they cannot be squared with tradition. He's a heretic. Not only is he a heretic, but the things he does prudentially are awful. um, I think the church is defected. I should go elsewhere. I should either go to SSPX, I should go Eastern Orthodox, whatever. What would you say to that person?
I would say the first thing I would say is be specific. Let's talk about one specific thing. Let's bring it up. Let's look at it. What theological note is it on? Does this mean the church has defected? If the church has defected, what does this mean about being Catholic? And then I would go deeper. Why be Catholic versus be something else? Like, okay, was there a historical Jesus? Did he rise from the dead? Did he found a church? I mean, I would say let's be specific and let's approach things rationally, not with rhetoric or reaction. And so, everything you pointed out to me, Dustin, I've heard before in my comment boxes, etc. And again, it might sound nice as an objection, but let's be specific. Let's evaluate, and that's how you get to the truth. And that's what I hope to do with my channel. Is okay. Let's address these things, and this is what Michael often does. And there
Yeah,
is an answer. Jesus was a historical person. He came. He came back from the dead. He resurrected. He founded a church. He made some promises. And Pope Francis is not a heretic. You might have quibbles, and I have quibbles with prudential decisions and even
sure.
certain things on certain theological notes where there seems to be a lack of continuity, maybe with Pope St. John Paul II. I don't know. The thing is, like, my ecclesiology accounts for this. And so I don't feel like I need to leave the church when I feel tension. That's what I would say.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, very well said. Very well said. And your channel is the Logos Project, right? So I encourage
That's right.
everybody, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Dom's channel. He's doing some fantastic work. That episode, I had to watch it in a couple parts on my lunch hour at
Yeah.
work, but fantastic with John Salza and Andrew Bartel.
Thank you.
Definitely want to check out more. So I encourage everybody to check out your channel, support you and what you're doing. So any parting words for us, Dom? So we've got all this confusion in the church. We've got scandal. We've got corruption. We've got these so-called traditionalist alternatives.
Yeah.
What is the will of God here? What should we do? What should one do at this crossroads?
I don't claim to have an actual answer to that, but what I can say is what's worked for me, my experience. And my experience has been a return to scripture, a falling in love with scripture, a studying it, a praying it, and an encounter with Christ in it. And then finally just nourish yourself with good resources. And I think your channel, Dustin's a great one. Reason in theology. There's resources out there, and in fact, they're growing. I would say because there is an issue here, and people are stepping up to address it. But go back to the scriptures and receive the Holy Eucharist and go to confession, but do so within the visible structure of the church. And that's the
Yeah.
only advice I can give because it's what I do, and it's because it's been working for me when it comes to making sense of what's going on. And yeah, tunnel vision it'll it doesn't lead anywhere good.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
broaden your horizons without relativizing things, because then you just become nothing. So yeah.
Yeah, and also remember how biblical our faith is. I mean, and I've spoken about this at length on my channel, is Christ is the new David, the church is the Davidic kingdom and Solomonic temple. So if we want the true biblical faith, this is where we go, where it's all fulfilled. You have the Davidic Melchizedek priest king Jesus. You have his royal vizier in the person of Peter. You have the
Mhm.
Queen Mother, the Gebirah, at the right hand of the king, who intercedes for the people of God.
Yes.
You've got the church as the temple. You've got the bread of the presence. You've got the holy oil of anointing. You've got the priestly vestments. You've got the altar. You've got incense.
Mhm.
I mean, this is the biblical faith, and so you want to attach yourself to that visible structure and remain united. And people have said, I forget who. I don't want to say his name, but somebody said Roman Catholicism teaches you humility. It teaches you to die to yourself and bear your cross. And what better exercise than remaining in communion with? It's like the ark, right? A bunch of stinky animals, and it's messy, right?
Yeah.
But um, you stay in the ark, because outside, if you jump outside into the waters, you're going to drown. And there's no point in going on to a life raft when the ship is right there. It's been sailing for 2,000 years. It ain't going anywhere. If we believe in the promise of Christ, we know that he can't lie, because he's God, and he'll keep his promise, and he's not weak. He's strong, and he will see his church to the end, to the Perusia. It will not fail. The gates of hell will not prevail. The
Mhm.
structure will not be overturned. So you remain in the bosom of Holy Mother Church, because he who does not have God for his father cannot have the church for his mother. So stay united in the bosom of Noah's Ark, the Ark of Salvation, the Holy Catholic Church.
Amen.
Well, guys, I greatly appreciate, well, first of all, Dom, I appreciate your work, your channel, your time, your
Thank you.
graciousness. I
Thank you.
can't tell you how much I enjoyed spending time with you this evening. I
Same.
want to thank all the viewers, especially Father John, for the questions and the comments. Very awesome, Father. Thank you. You've
Thank you.
been watching and or listening to Holy Smoke, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This is episode 77, The Errors and Dangers of Radical Traditionalism, with Dom Dalmasso of the Logos Project. Make sure you go to the Logos Project on YouTube and subscribe. Check out his content. It's great. Guys, stay safe out there. God bless. And I'm going to end the broadcast in 3, 2, 1.